Okay, thank you. I want to start off with a number, and that number is 37,452,000, which, as of last week, was the number of records that have been transcribed in FreeCEN. And why I think this is interesting, because I'm not a genealogist, I'm a population geographer, and I'm interested in how we can use a data set of this size to look at interesting questions in historical population geography. Some context, I'm in the Department of Information Studies at UCL. Within that, I'm in a research group, the UCL Centre for Digital Humanities. And digital humanities is all about the application of computational ideas and computational techniques to issues within the humanities. And so our understanding of history and how we can process large amounts of historical data is the sort of thing that comes into that. A couple of other things I work on, so second thing down here, I am part of the UK Data Service, which provides access to contemporary data from censuses and all sorts of things. And as part of that, I'm interested in migration data and journey to work data. And then finally, what's probably most relevant to this, I'm also part of a group called Census, which provide access and facilitate access for researchers to the ONS longitudinal study, which is a longitudinal sample of people from censuses from 1971 through to 2011. We've got 1% of the population of England and Wales and all their census returns over that period. So moving on to FreeCEN, this typical sort of query that someone might do in FreeCEN. So I've looked for someone, I've chose a name that I knew was in the data, Mini Tregenza, and I find 4 records that come back, and I can make those a little larger. So we've got 2 records from 1881, 2 records from 1891. One of the things I'm interested in is, are those the same people? And we can have various ways of looking at that. So I can look in FreeBMD to try and get some more information. And I can also look in FreeReg. And the combination of those helped me to find out more information about all of these people. I know I've had to do that manually, really. And one of the ways moving forward that I think would be useful for us to consider is the degree to which we can automate these searches and for one name search across multiple resources. When thinking about large amounts of census data and census data rather than as a genealogy resource, as a population data resource, there's a couple of different ways we can go down. One is to look at commercial sources of census data, and another is to look at existing academic sources. So a problem with commercial sources is this, that as soon as you want to look at a record, you have to pay for it. And that's difficult enough if you're researching your own family tree and have got lots of people that you want to get further information about. If you want it for tens of thousands of people or hundreds of thousands of people, then this clearly is a non-starter. There are existing academic sources of census data as well. So the Integrated Census Microdata Project has a complete transcription of census data from 1851 through to 1911. Fantastic. Except there are a couple of problems. The sequence doesn't include 1841, I'm not quite sure why, but that's obviously an advantage that FreeCEN has over ISAM. From the point of view of doing genealogy, ISAM's not set up for that sort of query. Access to names and addresses is restricted to accredited researchers. So it's no good as a source for looking up relatives. A further problem from sort of my point of view of doing research across lots of records is that the total amount of data you can download is limited to 1 million records at a time, which is a lot. But if you wanted to do research for the whole of the UK, it requires an awful lot of messing around. So moving on to some of the work that I've done with FreeCEN as an alternative to those two approaches. Starting off, I did a sort of pilot sample looking at a set of data in Norfolk. And just to test that the data sort of showed me the things I was hoping it was going to show me, this is a map of counties of birth of the people in the sample, and it shows the pattern that you'd expect it to show. Most of the people were born in Norfolk, and you get a decline as you move away from Norfolk. One of the things that I think is interesting that we can do with this data is to try and produce tables that weren't published at the time. So it's clearly at the time, the census results were published as volumes with all sorts of tables of data in them. But I'm interested in looking at whether we can now produce new tables of results that were never produced at the time. And one example of this that I produced just as an experiment was looking at the numbers of generations living within a household. So this is for a sample of data in Norfolk. And I had 2,000-ish households with one generation in, so either one person or people at the same level. 5,000 houses with 2 generations, so a parent and child. 3 generations with 740 households with 3 generations and 17 with 4 generations. And that was generated by looking at the relationship information written down on the census form about relationship to head of household. So to get 4 generations, you typically have to have someone saying they're a parent of the head of household, someone saying they're a child, and someone saying they're a grandchild. Moving on to what I want to talk about today, I've focused on Cornwall. And the reason why I think Cornwall is interesting is because it's the only county in FreeCEN that's completely coded for the whole of the sequence from 1841 to 1891, giving us a total of just over 2 million records to look at. And looking at all of those records at the same time, we can do various sorts of analysis. So this is a sort of fairly obvious thing to do of looking at counties of birth. And unsurprisingly, we find that the vast majority of people enumerated in Cornwall were born in Cornwall. But the percentage goes down over time from 95% in 1841 to 88% in 1891, fitting in with ideas that we might have about increasing mobility over the 19th century. Just over on the furthest column on the right, because we're in York today, I've added the number of people enumerated in Cornwall who were born in Yorkshire, which is not very many. Other sorts of interesting things we can do, and again, it's not particularly surprising, is to look at the distribution of names. So this is a word cloud of women's and girls' first names as recorded in the 1841 census. So the most common name was Mary, and second most common, Elizabeth, and so on. And that in itself isn't a surprise. The sort of point of doing this sort of thing, in a way, is to test that the data's doing what you expect it to do. But it highlights some of the issues. So if we look at Elizabeth, as we expect, we have lots of Elizabeths. But I've highlighted here some of the other variant spellings that are recorded in census forms. And if we come back to that issue of, is this person the same as that person? This is where this starts to become a problem, because in one census, they might have their name written as Elizabeth, and in a later census, it might be written as Eliz, TH, with a dot on the end, without a dot on the end, who knows? Looking at the end of the sequence, this is from 1891. And again, these are people recorded in the census, not people born in 1891. Again, we see Elizabeth. Again, we see lots of variants of Elizabeth. But we also start to see different names as well. So I've highlighted here, bottom left, Florence, it doesn't occur in 1841, or certainly not amongst the most popular names. And using the 1891 data, we can look at that a little bit more. So this is a graph of the number of Florences in Cornwall in 1891 by year of birth. And you see this huge increase from almost none to quite a lot. And of course, the reason for that is Florence Nightingale. The name Florence was almost entirely unheard of until Florence Nightingale became famous. So I've highlighted here, that's sort of 1857 when Longfellow published his poem about Florence Nightingale. And around the same time, there were reports in the Times about Florence Nightingale. So she became a celebrity and lots of people named their children Florence. So, as I said, what I'm interested in is constructing longitudinal data. Can we find the same person in a series of censuses? And my context, as I say, I work on current longitudinal data. And that is relatively easy to link people because we have date of birth in the census now. But 1971 was the first census in which we asked date of birth. Before then, all we've got is age in years. And that's a lot harder to link people on. So what we have to try and do is think about whether people are identifiable, whether they're a unique person, because that makes it quite easy to match them. Here we've got a couple of different mini trigenzas, and we've got different possibilities of how they might connect to each other, all of which might be wrong. But if we look at some of the supporting information, this is an example where I think it's fairly likely that this is the same person. We see her in 1881, born in 1873 or 74, and another person of the same name 10 years later, same birth date, living in the same place. It's probably the same person. But how can we start to be more sure about this, which is what I'm interested in? And I started to look at uniqueness of names. So this is a graph where I plotted the number of people that have a particular name. So over on the left of the axis, the lines start with one person having a particular name. So that name is unique within the census in Cornwall. In this case, the bottom line, the red line, is 1841. If the colours don't come out, the summary is that the lowest line is 1841, and then we get a really neat progression up to 1891 with it steadily changing. So in 1841, about 27% of women had a unique name, and that's surname plus forename. By 1891, it had gone up to about 52% of women in Cornwall, women or girls, sorry, in Cornwall having a unique surname and forename. So that's interesting. That's going to help us find unique people, but still 52% is a lot less than we really need to be able to work with. This is the same chart for men, and you see a very similar sort of thing. So just in terms of reading these charts, if we move further along the line, I've highlighted sort of a point on two axes. Here, we're looking at groups where 100 people have the same name. And reading over onto the y-axis, 90% of the population in Cornwall in 1841, the population of males, were accounted for by groups having 100 people with the same name or fewer. And it goes up to sort of hundreds and hundreds, sort of 700-ish, I think, people having the same name. And in Cornwall, that's John Williams and Mary Williams. They're the people that we have hundreds and hundreds of people with the same name. We can increase the chances of identifying people as being unique by looking at some of their other characteristics. So this is including birthplace. So I'm looking at name and birthplace and saying, is that a unique combination? And we get a very similar shaped set of lines, but the thing to notice, we're higher up the y-axis, and we don't go nearly as far over on the x-axis. So sort of 63-ish% of people, here I'm talking about all people, not differentiating by sex. 63% of people in 1851 were unique on the combination of name and birthplace. And so 90% of people, sort of looking at this line here, are in groups of 1, 2, 3, or 4 people sharing a name and a birthplace. So we've still got a lot of noise in the data, but much, much less than if we look at name alone. So we have 64% in 1851, going up to 76%. If we look at age rather than birthplace, get a similar sort of distribution. If we look at age and birthplace, so what's your name, how old are you, where were you born in the census, 98% of people were unique on that combination in 1851, and it increases up to 99% in 1891. So that's looking really good. Almost everyone's unique on just 3 bits of data. And that entirely fits with what we observe today about uniqueness of names and identifiers. So this bodes really well for being able to match people between censuses. And I've just done this for Cornwall. So we'd expect if we were doing this for the whole of the UK, that uniqueness would drop a bit, but sort of 98, 99% is looking really good. But it's not going to be quite as easy as that, unfortunately. Just because people are unique within a census, if we start comparing censuses, people might not match between censuses. And there's a number of reasons that might happen. We've got errors in completing the census, so the results will be inconsistent across years, variations in spelling or presentation of name. And what I mean by presentation of name is whether you put a second name in, whether you put an initial in, whether you have some different way of punctuating your name, something like that. Either you or whoever's filling in the census form. Variations in a similar way of the spelling of your birthplace and variations in recall of your birthplace. And we also get errors introduced by transcribers as well. And as someone who's interested in sort of piggybacking, if you like, on the excellent work that genealogists are doing to produce FreeCEN and FreeReg and so on, I don't want to be too rude about them and concentrate on errors, but there are errors that become apparent. So some examples of that, errors in filling in the census. Here I've got 2 population pyramids, one from 1841, one from 1851, both for Cornwall. And this shows that people don't always follow the instructions that are given in census forms. In 1841, people were told to give single years of age up to 15, and then 5-year, the nearest 5-year multiple of age. And we can see that that happens most of the time, but there's a small core of people who write a single year of age in 1841 if they're an adult, and also children are reported with 5-year age bands rather than single years of age. So all of this is adding noise into the data. An example of transcriber error here. This is a graph of marital age differences for people in Cornwall in 1881. So if you're on the right-hand side of this chart, the husband is older than the wife. If you're on the left-hand side of it, the wife is older than the husband. And all of this data in the middle, that's what you'd expect. Sometimes the wife's older, sometimes the husband's older. Most of the time, the husband's older than the wife, sort of mean observations. But we get these long tails on either side. of people being 40, 50, 60 years older than their spouse. Possible, but unlikely. So I picked out some examples of the most extreme values. So there are 3 households here, sort of delineated by the shading. And the first one, we've got Mary, who's the wife, who's 73, and William, who's the husband, who's 17. I think that's almost certainly a transcription error, and William's age was 77, not 17. Similarly with these other cases here. Possible that it's correct, but unlikely. But again, I think this is something that might be interesting to look at a bit further, because it might help with error checking in data, either as the data are captured or in a phase of looking for errors in data and then returning to the original images and seeing whether that age really is right. So various reasons why the data might be inconsistent between censuses. We can start to look for matching sets of names. So rather than just one person, look for one person and the name of the person they live with. If I'm trying to match from one census to another, I can say I'm going to search for people who've got the same name in, say, 1881 as someone in 1891 who looks like they're the same person, and their age is exactly 10 years different. So that'll take out a lot of the sort of mismatch of people who've got the same name but are entirely different people. 10 years is slightly too pedantic. You could be 9 years different or 11 years different because the census wasn't held on the same date in each decade. So using those ideas, if I'm trying to look at individuals, just looking at people with the same name, whose age is 10 years different, I get 51,000 matches between 1881 and 1891. So that's not bad. That's out of sort of 300,000-ish people at each time. If I add in birthplace, that goes down to 41,000. So fewer people, but I'm a lot more confident that they're a genuine match because they're birthplace matches as well. And looking within households, looking for 2 people who are married, you've got 2 people with a set of names in 1881, another 2 people with exactly the same names in 1891. They're both saying the same birthplace in 1881 and 1891, and they're both exactly 10 years different in the sets of records. We go down to 2,000, which is a big drop because we've got a much more demanding search key. It's going to be disrupted by any spelling errors or anything. But I think we could be really, really confident that they are genuinely the same people 10 years later. So what am I sort of ultimately interested in doing this for? Is start to look at other bits of data in the census. So I've got 3 groups of records here from that set of people I've matched from 1881 to 1891. So some people up at the top who, what I looked for were people who had wife in their occupation string in 1881 and widow in 1891. And do they look like they're the same person? Yes, we've gone from farmer wife to farmer's widow, again with the next person, and tin miner wife to tin miner's widow. So a sort of sad story of what's happened to these people, but it looks like they're fairly good matches of people. Similarly, I looked at records where the occupation title started assistant in 1881, and now we see some nice sort of social progression there. So we've got someone who's gone from assistant draper to draper's assistant, just a change in title really. But we've also got sort of someone who's gone from assistant farmer to farmer, for example. So we can look at progression in occupation, both for men and women. Another record, this one might require a bit more looking at because we've gone from assistant cook to dressmaker retired, which possible, but looks a bit like it's a false match. And at the bottom, the person I first started looking for, Minnie Tregenza, she was aged 7 in 1881, so she didn't have an occupation, but she's a general servant 10 years later. So what am I interested in doing next? Trying to validate results. I say some of those matches look right, some of them look a bit iffy. Look at more flexible match keys. I've looked for exactly the same spellings of names and birthplaces. If we allow a bit of flexibility, can we get a good match that we're still confident about, but get more numbers? More use of household structure. I've just looked at married couples. If you look at someone with a child in the house, does that child age 10 years as well? Can that help you follow some of this? Comparison of transcription quality. I've done some very early looking at the differences between FreeCEN and the ISEM dataset that I mentioned right at the beginning. It's a bit hard to do because in ISEM you don't get name and address, but you do get enumeration district, dwelling number, schedule number, all that sort of thing. So you can match these up. Do they have the same level of transcription? Do the same sorts of errors occur? And finally, extending this beyond Cornwall, sort of ultimately to all of the FreeCEN data that we've got. And that brings me to the end of my slide. So happy to take any questions.
What happens with Minnie Tregenza, born in 1851?
Yeah.
1876, she gets married.
Yeah.
So how does that?
Well, that's
can you do the genealogy bit now?
Not yet, but that's absolutely something I want to go on to. As I said, it'd be really useful if we could tie up FreeCEN with FreeReg and FreeBMD. In the sort of FreeReg search I showed very briefly at the beginning, yeah, there's a marriage record. So I can pick up the change of surname from that. And that would greatly expand the number of sort of matches I get, or certainly of women.
Would that be skewing your data?
Yeah, very much so.
And on the occupation,
yeah,
don't you run the risk of people just thinking farmer sounds better than assistant farmer? So I'll be a farmer this time around.
Yeah.
Because you see this all the time in marriage records.
Yes.
The occupation, you know, they're a shop assistant, but you know, they're a shop owner when they get married because that sounds better.
Yeah, I think you're right. So just as with the sort of quality of matches, you have to sort of take it with a pinch of salt as to whether or not it's a true match. That change in occupation, you have to change.
Social progression.
Yeah.
It's very dangerous ground if you're just relying on what somebody told somebody.
Yes, yeah, I agree. So yes, you have to have a lot of caution about that. One of the things that I think is interesting to look at is the diversity of occupation for women, and how that changes over the course of the century.
The tools that you're using on this, are they more the traditional tools, or are they starting to use some of the more advanced, powerful sort of Watson, IBM Watson and AI type tools on this?
At the moment, it's entirely sort of traditional, putting it all into a SQL database and doing queries on that. Yeah, as we go on to sort of more flexible matching of people, yeah, looking at more advanced approaches to doing that matching might be useful. I'm sort of talking with some of the other sort of board members at lunchtime about Soundex and similar things, looking for similar sounding names or names that might be the same but are spelt differently. That's somewhere we could go. It'd increase the number of matches, but more of them would be wrong as well. So there's there's balances of confidence and how many matches you can get.
Sorry, interesting enough.
Yeah.
I guess interesting enough, this is all leading towards, like I was talking to an individual in Thompson was, and he was saying, I agree with him around, being able to see the group of people.
Yeah.
Together.
Yeah.
And I guess that's where we're heading. Just group, you should see that group together.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, over the course of 10 years, obviously the sort of household group can change quite a lot. People will move into households, children will, grow up and move somewhere else. New children will be born. Obviously, you've got mortality to take into account as well. But looking at the passage of groups of people is sort of one of the areas to take this.
But even then, sorry,
Yeah.
but even then you've got, the sun might move away, but in some of those earlier censuses, they don't move very far.
Oh, no.
So, you should be able to pick that up as being part of that same original group, but with a separate entry in the census with a different family and whatnot. So ultimately, we should be able to do that.
We should, yeah. I mean, some of the sort of early sort of seminal work on migration is based on the 1881 census, and be really interesting to see if we can sort of recreate that, probably with sort of 1871 or 1891, because there's far more data for those 2 years. But Ernst Ravenstein sort of wrote some papers on what he termed were the laws of migration through analysis of the 1881 census. And I think it'd be interesting to return to the individual data and see if you can do the same sorts of things that he was doing.
Have you tried to reproduce the original published statistics?
How
well do they compare?
No, I haven't, and you're absolutely right. That's something to do. I suppose I haven't done that yet because I'm sort of still working on that. In a sense, that's the kind of boring bit. But I have done sort of looking at population pyramids and similar sorts of distributions to see, generally, do they look like they're the right distribution? But comparing to the published tables, you're right. For sort of age and sex, that's fairly easy to do. For occupation, that was recoded at the time from the hundreds of different occupations we have to a much smaller fixed vocabulary. So if I was to try and do that, I'd need to reproduce that recoding, which would be years of work.
Place of birth, the county of birth stuff is published as well.
Yeah.
So it would be just interesting to know how accurate those.
Oh yeah, the overall population. Yes.
And have an idea about how large the rest of the country is, because all that recoding was done centrally.
Yeah.
This question of identifying matches must arise in many areas of investigation, apart from genealogy. And I used to be a statistician, so I came across some of these in completely other areas. And I'm sure you probably know this, but it might be just worth mentioning 2 sort of standard statistical methods of doing it. Well, one involves creating what's called a dissimilarity index to measure the distances and so on, and that provides very plotting procedures. You probably know about that. And the other is sort of Bayesian decisional diagnostic tools, which take a sequential approach, which is rather like you've done, starting with this one and then moving down. And then you can sort of decide which variables are most important. I feel sure that you can learn from areas and completely other areas of application.
I mean, this is a sort of fairly early stage. As I sort of said at the beginning, I also work on contemporary linkage projects, and that they do similar things, but they have the huge advantage that you've got date of birth, whereas we've just got age in years here. So yes, you can do matching, but I think it's always going to be a bit more coarse and involve a bit more sort of guess and prayer.
One of the interesting ones on the census is looking at the 1939 register.
Yeah.
And on that, you get date of birth.
Yeah.
So and obviously, you can take all the people there who were born pre-1881 or 1891. Are you going to look at trying to match them to where they were in the census? It doesn't have place of birth, it has date of birth.
It has date of birth, yeah. I mean, I think you'd have to use other things as a bridge. So if you can sort of find things in FreeReg or FreeBMD that give you more information about date of birth, you could. We do use the 1939 register in the Celsius project, sort of linking it to to 1971 and forward data because it's got date of birth. Although the data we've got are not ideal, I think. I think they've been improved since the linkage was done. There are interesting questions about whether we could link back from current work. There are people in the 1971 census, lots of people who were born in the 19th century, because you only had to be older than 70 to have been born in the 19th century.
There's one thing I was thinking, like in the 1911 census, you got the 5 children,
Yes.
the ones who died. So, and often doing family history, you find that those 2 died in between censuses.
Yes.
So, are those population statistics not going into your data at the moment then?
Well, this only goes up to 1891. So yeah, I haven't got the sort of fertility stuff that's in 1911. Yeah, I mean, so linking to pre-BMD or free-reg, I'd tell you a lot more about intercensal children. Using FreeCEN alone, which is what I'm doing at the moment, all I've got to go on is what people said in the census.
You were saying about commercial people, you can't
Yeah.
get at it. But I wonder what would happen if you went to MrAncestry.com, whoever's in charge,
Yeah.
and explain what you were doing. Would you actually be able to get access to the data?
You might be able to. My understanding is that some people have been able to run similar sorts of searches on sort of private copies, if you like, of the ancestry data. I think the reason why I'm focusing on FreeCEN is I'm interested in how can anyone do this. So limit it entirely to open data. Yes, that's not quite true because I'm using a sort of full copy of the open data that was given to me to work on rather than going via the FreeCEN interface. But in principle, it's exactly the same data and exactly the same licensing conditions. Whereas if you were working with a version of Ancestry, it'd be the same data, but it wouldn't be the same licensing conditions. Okay, we're probably massively overrun, aren't we?
Yes, just a bit. Thank you, Oliver. Well,
3 minutes ago.
about 15 minutes behind. So if you could shave a little bit off, possibly, yeah. No worries. Oh, yes, please, that would be a kindness. I'm going to try sitting, Mike. Is this on? Is that on? Brilliant. I'm going to try clipping it to me so that I can get it off quickly. Either that or we'll need to go home with the University of York's mic clipped to me. Great, thank you. Thank you, Oliver. As they say, now follow that. I am, page down, going to give you a very short history of FreeCEN. Some of this started as a talk to be written by Brenda, who's sitting in the audience somewhere beyond my sight. Hello, Brenda, who you will find out in this talk has been there for almost since the early days, the first day. But it then became apparent that actually I would have to do this because Brenda was not able to complete what she was doing for various reasons and also not able to speak, although you may feel that Brenda would be better at doing this than I am. I've also taken a lot of this from the historic snapshots of FreeCEN website, which are on the Internet Archive, and you can get up through the Wayback Machine. Brenda first joined the project as a coordinator for Nottinghamshire about 1 month after it started. The project was one of its main instigator was Brian Randall of Genealogy, and Genealogy's Devon coordinator, I'm not sure if that's the right term, and of Newcastle University, with considerable and ongoing support from Bob Muchamore in Australia. And the 1981 census of Devon was instigated as its pilot's project, followed in mid-2000 by the 1891 Cornwall transcription. By the end of the year, 4 other counties had been initiated and more ensued. Bob took over the general coordination of the project in August 2001, and considerable aid to the project at this stage was also given by the late Roy Conibert, and of Canada. I do apologise for mispronouncing people's names here. At this point, Brenda took on the role of helping anyone with queries, working alongside Bob, partly because with the introduction of Microsoft XP and Bob only having Windows 2032, he had difficulty in helping some of them. So they started to share the issues. Then, following the death of Bob in 2004, Brenda became the assistant chair to Dave Newbury, who had taken over as chairman. When Dave himself became seriously ill in 2008, Brenda took over chair temporarily, and then 2 years later, after Dave sadly passed away, took over as chair in its entirety. So, who was who in 2006? You can see this is just at that point. Dave as chairman, Brenda as vice chair, and a number of other people, including Graham, who's in the room at the moment, and Carol Barber, who's also in the room, whose title at that point was Northern Recruiting. This is the census from, oh no, I got ahead of myself there. If I go back up. Right, at this point, you'll see also there were a coordinator, especially for Scotland, and we have Michelle's descendant, as it were, with us today as well. The Wales coordinator post, I think, has been replaced by Brenda wearing another hat. But first, for some more details about the work. In the beginning, the trustees of FreeBMD, as it was then, worked with the Church of Latter-day Saints, and Geoffrey Molam is particularly remembered for his help with this. And the LDS sent the FreeCEN management the 1891 census on microfiche, which they then passed on to coordinators for the county. So to be a transcriber, you had to have a microfiche reader, and some already had them, or they bought one themselves. They also had to have a computer with a floppy disk drive or an external floppy disk drive. Those that did not have access to a microfiche reader had to use the one at the local library or archives, and they often went in once or twice a week. Not with a computer, of course, because you couldn't carry your own computer, but with a piece of paper and a pen or a pencil, because that was what the regulation said you have to have. Then they went home and transcribed from what they'd written down in the archive or at the local library into the computer. I feel this may be where some of the errors may have crept in. Not through any ill will on the part of the transcribers, but they were really didn't have the advantages that we have today, where you get split screens and you can work with 2 screens beside one another, one with the image, one with the spreadsheet. Each transcriber then kept repeating that, kept going back to the library or looking at the image online and filling in a spreadsheet type tool or a spreadsheet until they'd finished a piece. Remember that each piece in a census can have about 150 images to over 500 images, and each image has 30 people to a page. So that is a huge amount of transcription which is done by a single person. For Nottinghamshire, one of Brenda's helpers took on the role of going round to businesses and libraries and asking if they'd got any readers that were going spare. And at the time, there were quite a lot of them that were going spare from car dealerships who were no longer using car data on fiche, and were quite happy to pass them on. And other coordinators were able to do the same. And then, of course, having collected a microfiche reader, the coordinator then had to deliver them to the transcriber. Once the transcriber had got access to a fiche reader, the coordinator then had to pass the microfiche on to them. The transcriptions were created or copied onto a floppy disk, which was then returned, also by post, to the coordinator, along with the original microfiche. A few had an internet account and would email them. There's an innovation. The coordinator then posted the CD and the fiche onto a checker, who again had to have a PC with a floppy disk drive. To see what needed to be checked and to proofread the spreadsheet, the checkers used a tool called CSV Check, which was written by Peter Cox. Peter was unable to update it when Windows came in, so he sent the program to Brenda, and Brenda's son updated it to the version that is still used today. As you might imagine, with this process, some microfiche got lost in the post. And to stop this happening, and so that people didn't have to use a microfiche reader, a volunteer, Kevin, was appointed as the project's first digitizer. He copied the images from microfiche to CD or DVD. To do this, Brenda recorded the images, sent them over to Kevin. So others sent their images directly to Kevin. Kevin then posted the resulting CDs to the coordinators and a copy to Brenda for security. And this exercise took more than a year, was taken over by Kevin's daughter Stacey after his death, and is continued today by Helen Bainbridge, who's here doing the photographs and has probably been taking your money for the quiz as well. The final stage of quality control in FreeCEN is validation. And I'd like to read you the instructions from 2004. The county coordinator or their appointed delegate will clear queries passed back by the checkers. The output file from this process will be passed to the database maintainer, and this will be scanned for acceptability before formatting an upload file for the online database loading. The upload file will be in comma-separated value ASCII file format. Please note, and this bit is in red, if you have started validating using valsends, you must complete the validation using valsends. If you need a replacement for the valsends routine as you were partway through a piece, please request this through the helpers mailing list. You can see by 2004 emails beginning to catch on. It continues, note, because of the manner in which the program operates, it is of considerable advantage to use a PC with a minimum 400 megahertz processor and a recent hard drive. So this is what the earliest recorded version of FreeCEN looks like. It went live, well, this is the July 2003 version. It went live earlier that year, I think. The online database facilities were developed by Dave Mile of the core FreeCEN tech team, and a trustee, was and still is a trustee of Free UK Genealogy, and worked together particularly with Stuart Morgan. The website notes that the initial years, 150 volunteers had doubled in 12 months, and in the first 4 years had reached 500 transcribers. Oops. 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 So that was 2004. By 2006, it's changed just a little bit in the design. It had a revamp and the logo was being changed. And there were now 2,000 transcribers. Because of the difficulties we were having with getting access to the 1981 censuses, Trustee Dave Mile and FreeCEN manager Dave Newbury were in contact with a project called Archive CD Books, which provided us with images on CD instead. And it started with the 1861 census. And we are very thankful to Rod Neep, whose brainchild Archive CD Books was, for making this possible. What are we doing for time? I'll just skip that. Unfortunately, that partnership wasn't able to continue, but we've recently remade contact with Rod and hope this will open up more to us. Contact was renewed with the Latter-day Saints, and the CDs for 1841, 51, 61 and 71 were ordered by and sent to a court who was also a member of a church, which continued for some, and this project, this access continued for some time until the LDS decided for economic reasons to stop supplying any more CDs to any organisation around the world. And there were a number of us working like this with the LDS at the time. Some were local record offices, have worked and continue to work with us to transcribe their county, and the Cornwall and Devon services are a good example of that. Devon, as I mentioned, was the original FreeCEN project, and we have to date transcribed all of 41, about half of 51, with the rest waiting for being proofread, all of 61, we've almost finished 81, and have transcribed all of 91. Devon won't be the first to be completed. That honour has gone to Cornwall, but we now have the 1971 images almost ready to transcribe. And last year, the LDS very kindly gave us the microfiche from the Nottingham Family History Centre, as they were no longer needed there. And we now have fiche for counties from 1891, which were never with us in the first place, and for missing pieces from otherwise completed counties. This talk has been an opportunity to name check many of the people who have helped FreeCEN over the last 20 years, and to mention others in groups such as the transcribers. Thank you all. As Brenda says, you don't do it for the glory. You do it because it is close to your hearts. Thank you all very much for giving us such a wonderful resource.